These detestable customs, however, had been long discontinued, neither was there any present observance of the statues. I had the curiosity to inquire what would be done to any of Chowbok's tribe if they crossed over into Erewhon. I was told that nobody knew, inasmuch as such a thing had not happened for ages. They would be too ugly to be allowed to go at large, but not so much as to be criminally liable. Their offence in having come would be a moral one, but they would be beyond the straightener's art. Possibly they would be consigned to the hospital of incurable bores, and made to work at being bored for so many hours a day by the Erewhonian inhabitants of the hospital, who are extremely impatient of one another's boredom, but would soon die if they had no one whom they might bore. In fact, that they would be kept as professional borees. When I heard this, it occurred to me that some rumors of its substance might perhaps have become current among Chowbok's people, for the agony of his fear had been too great to have been inspired by the mere dread of being burnt alive before the statues. I also questioned them about the Museum of Old Machines and the cause of the apparent retrogression in all arts, sciences, and inventions. I learnt that about 400 years previously the state of mechanical knowledge was far beyond our own and was advancing with prodigious rapidity, until one of the most learned professors of hypothetics wrote an extraordinary book, from which I propose to give extracts later on, proving that the machines were ultimately destined to supplant the race of man and to become instinct with a vitality as different from, and superior to, that of animals as animal to vegetable life. So convincing was his reasoning, or unreasoning, to this effect, that he carried the country with him, and they made a clean sweep of all machinery that had not been in use for more than 271 years, which period was arrived at after a series of compromises, and strictly forbade all further improvements and inventions under pain of being considered in the eye of the law to be laboring under typhus fever, which they regard as one of the worst of all crimes. This is the only case in which they have confounded mental and physical diseases, and they do it even here as an avowed legal fiction. I became uneasy when I remembered about my watch, but they comforted me with the assurance that transgression in this matter was now so unheard of, that the law could afford to be lenient towards an utter stranger, especially towards one who had such a good character, they meant physique, and such beautiful light hair. Moreover, the watch was a real curiosity, and would be a welcome addition to the Metropolitan collection, so they did not think I need let it trouble me seriously. I will write, however, more fully upon this subject when I deal with the Colleges of Unreason and the Book of the Machines. In about a month from the time of our starting, I was told that our journey was nearly over. The bandage was now dispensed with, for it seemed impossible that I should ever be able to find my way back without being captured. Then we rolled merrily along the streets of a handsome town, and got on to a long, broad, and level road, with poplar trees on either side. The road was raised slightly above the surrounding country, and had formerly been a railway. The fields on either side were in the highest conceivable cultivation, but the harvest and also the vintage had already been gathered. The weather had got cooler more rapidly than could be quite accounted for by the progress of the season, so I rather thought we must have been making away from the sun, and were some degrees farther from the equator than when we started. Even here the vegetation showed that the climate was a hot one, yet there was no lack of vigor among the people. On the contrary, they were a very hardy race, and capable of great endurance. For the 100th time I thought that, take them all round, I had never seen their equals in respective physique, and they looked as good-natured as they were robust. The flowers were for the most part over, but their absence was in some measure compensated for by a profusion of delicious fruit, closely resembling the figs, peaches, and pears of Italy and France. I saw no wild animals, but birds were plentiful, as much as in Europe, but not tame as they had been on the other side the ranges. They were shot at with the crossbow and with arrows, gunpowder being unknown, or at any rate not in use. We were now nearing the metropolis, and I could see great towers and fortifications, and lofty buildings that looked like palaces. I began to be nervous as to my reception, but I had got on very well so far, and resolved to continue upon the same plan as hitherto, namely, to behave just as though I were in England until I saw that I was making a blunder, and then to say nothing till I could gather how the land lay. We drew nearer and nearer. The news of my approach had got abroad, and there was a great crowd collected on either side of the road, who greeted me with marks of most respectful curiosity, keeping me bowing constantly in acknowledgment from side to side. When we were about a mile off, we were met by the mayor and several councillors, among whom was a venerable old man, who was introduced to me by the mayor, for so I suppose I should call him, as the gentleman who had invited me to his house. I bowed deeply and told him how grateful I felt to him, and how gladly I would accept his hospitality. He forbade me to say more, and pointing to his carriage, which was close at hand, he motioned me to a seat therein. I again bowed profoundly to the mayor and councillors, and drove off with my entertainer, whose name was Senaj Nosnibor. After about half a mile the carriage turned off the main road, and we drove under the walls of the town till we reached a palazzo on a slight eminence, and just on the outskirts of the city. This was Senaj Nosnibor's house, and nothing can be imagined finer. It was situated near the magnificent and venerable ruins of the old railway station, which formed an imposing feature from the gardens of the house. The grounds, some 10 or dozen acres in extent, were laid out in terraced gardens, one above the other, with flights of broad steps ascending and descending the declivity of the garden. On these steps there were statues of most exquisite workmanship. Besides the statues were vases filled with various shrubs that were new to me, and on either side the flights of steps there were rows of old cypresses and cedars, with grassy alleys between them. Then came choice vineyards, and orchards of fruit trees in full bearing. The house itself was approached by a courtyard, and round it was a corridor onto which rooms opened, as in Pompeii. In the middle of the court there was a bath and a fountain. Having passed the court, we came to the main body of the house, which was 2 stories in height. The rooms were large and lofty. Perhaps at first they looked rather bare of furniture, but in hot climates people generally keep their rooms more bare than they do in colder ones. I missed also the sight of a grand piano or some similar instrument, there being no means of producing music in any of the rooms save the larger drawing-room, where there were half a dozen large bronze gongs, which the ladies used occasionally to beat about at random. It was not pleasant to hear them, but I have heard quite as unpleasant music both before and since. Mr. Nosnibor took me through several spacious rooms till we reached a boudoir, where were his wife and daughters, of whom I had heard from the interpreter. Mrs. Nosnibor was about 40 years old and still handsome, but she had grown very stout. Her daughters were in the prime of youth and exquisitely beautiful. I gave the preference almost at once to the younger, whose name was Erewhon, for the elder sister was haughty, while the younger had a very winning manner. Mrs. Nosnibor received me with the perfection of courtesy, so that I must have indeed been shy and nervous if I had not at once felt welcome. Scarcely was the ceremony of my introduction well completed before a servant announced that dinner was ready in the next room. I was exceedingly hungry, and the dinner was beyond all praise. Can the reader wonder that I began to consider myself in excellent quarters? That man embezzle money, I thought to myself, impossible. But I noticed that my host was uneasy during the whole meal, and that he ate nothing but a little bread and milk. Towards the end of the dinner there came a tall, lean man with a black beard, to whom Mr. Nosnibor and the whole family paid great attention. He was the family straightener. With this gentleman Mr. Nosnibor retired into another room, from which there presently proceeded a sound of weeping and wailing. I could hardly believe my ears, but in a few minutes I got to know for a certainty that they came from Mr. Nosnibor himself. "Poor papa," said Erewhon, as she helped herself composedly to the salt. "How terribly he has suffered." "Yes," answered her mother, "but I think he is quite out of danger now." Then they went on to explain to me the circumstances of the case and the treatment which the straightener had prescribed, and how successful he had been, all which I will reserve for another chapter, and put rather in the form of a general summary of the opinions current upon these subjects, than in the exact words in which the facts were delivered to me. The reader, however, is earnestly requested to believe that both in this next chapter, and in those that follow it, I have endeavoured to adhere most conscientiously to the strictest accuracy, and that I have never willingly misrepresented, though I may have sometimes failed to understand all the bearings of an opinion or custom. End of chapter 9.